The laughter started before Lena Cole even finished her sentence. She was standing at the front of the training hall on Verk 9, holding a data pad with both hands, reading from a record she had memorized long before. Today, the hall was wide and cold, the way all academy spaces were designed to feel. Serious, to remind you that what happened inside them carried weight. 42 cadets from 6 different species sat in tiered rows, each one trained, each one certain of their own value. Commander Sale Vorn was in the 3rd row, which he always chose because the 3rd row felt like presence without desperation. He was Kreth, 4 arms, a ridged forehead, and a way of sitting that made the chair look too small for the ambition inside him. He had entered the advanced program with 11 commendations and the kind of reputation that walked into rooms before he did. When the clicking sound came from his throat, the sharp, dismissive click that meant something between disbelief and mockery, it moved through the room like a signal. Lena lowered the data pad. The cultural exchange exercise had been Director Pellin's idea. Each cadet was to present one legendary warrior from their own species, not the most powerful, not the most decorated, but the one whose story best captured what their kind was made of when everything had gone wrong. It was meant to build understanding between coalition members. So far it had built a quiet competition that no one had named aloud. Vorn had spoken first. He described Warlord Sareth of the Kreth, 4-armed conqueror who had brought down 3 star systems in under a decade, not through superior numbers, but through a strategy so precise it had become part of academy curriculum. Sareth had reportedly never lost battle in his life, and every Kreth soldier alive knew his name before they knew their own rank structure. Vorn told the story the way someone tells a story they have told before and always enjoyed telling. The room gave him exactly the reception he expected. Yara Ox went next. She was Thulian tall, pale, with eyes that held a color that had no name in most languages. She described a mind commander called Velth, who had faced an enemy fleet of 600 warships and dismantled it without a weapon being fired. Velth had entered the minds of the enemy captains all at once and shown them the same thing, a complete and absolute end, until not one of them could continue. The room went very quiet in a way that had nothing performative about it. It was simply real. Then Director Pellin said Lena's name. She walked to the front and told the story of George Hartwell. George Hartwell was not a general or a conqueror. He was not a mind warrior or a fleet commander. He was an Earth soldier from a time when humanity had not yet seen another star up close. He had been part of a unit that was hit hard and forced into a retreat. The retreat route ran through a narrow mountain pass. Someone had to stay and hold it long enough for the others to get through. Hartwell had stayed. He held that pass for 11 hours with a weapon that stopped working in the 2nd hour. He used the ground, the rocks, the angles of the terrain, and a decision that he had made once and then simply acted on without ever revisiting it. When his unit came back for him at the 12th hour, he was still there. The clicking sound from Vorn came somewhere around the 7th sentence. No energy weapons, Vorn said. It was not quite a question. No physical enhancement, no remote support capability. No, Lena said, none of that. The laughter spread quickly. The Draven Cadet near the back made a low grinding sound. Two Pelari cadets exchanged a glance, even some of the quieter aliens in the middle rows let their expressions shift towards something that did not try to hide what it meant. Yara Axe did not laugh. She pressed two fingers lightly to her temple and gave Lena the kind of look that is somehow more cutting than laughter. What you have described, she said, is one soldier at one location during one engagement performing a necessary function. That is not legend. A legend shapes the course of events beyond itself. What Velf did change the direction of a war. What your Harwell did preserved a unit. I do not say this to diminish your people. I say it because the word legend carries a meaning that should not be reduced. Lena held her gaze for 3 full seconds. Then she picked up her data pad, walked back to her seat and sat down. Connor Webb was 2 seats to her left. He leaned toward her immediately, keeping his voice low. You are not going to respond to that? No. She basically said our legends are not real legends. I heard her. And that does not bother you. Lena set the data pad flat on the desk in front of her. Not particularly. Connor stared at her for a moment, then sat back with the expression of someone filing the conversation away to be frustrated about later. At the back of the hall, Admiral Owen Vassar sat alone at the end of the last row. He was 71 years old. He had a limp in his left leg from an injury that had happened so long ago. It was now simply part of how he moved. His uniform was gray and almost completely bare of markings, a few small pins near the left collar, the kind that required looking closely to even identify. Most of the cadets had already decided he was some kind of administrative observer. A few had not noticed him at all. He had heard Lena's story. He had heard the laughter. He had heard Yara Axe's precise and patient verdict on the worth of human legends. He reached for the cup of water on the small table beside his chair, took one quiet sip and set it back down. He did not look troubled. He did not look amused. He looked the way a very old mountain looks, as if it had already decided long ago that the weather was not something worth arguing with. Lena turned in her seat for just a second and found his eyes. He gave her the smallest nod, not encouragement, not sympathy, something more like acknowledgement, like two people who had read the same book and did not need to discuss it. She turned back to face the front. The smile that touched her face was small and private and gone before anyone could see it. In the 3rd row, Vaughn was already talking about something else entirely. That was fine. That was always how it started. The veterans' reception was held on level 6 of the Academy station in a long hall with wide arched ceilings and observation panels that ran the full length of one wall, looking out into open space. The room had been designed for exactly this kind of event, the kind where history was meant to be felt in the air. Coalition portraits lined the walls, above head height, each one showing a celebrated commander in the formal posture of their species, Kareth. Generals with all 4 arms spread wide, Thulian admirals with their eyes half closed in the expression of deep authority, Draven fleet commanders frozen in angles that still somehow suggested motion. There were no human portraits. Lena had noticed that the first time she had ever been in this room. She had not said anything about it then. She did not say anything about it now as she stood near the far end of the hall, with a glass of something pale and mineral tasting, and watched the room fill. The veterans were brought in by degree of recognition, which in practice meant by degree of importance. Hask Rowe entered early, which surprised exactly no one. He was the most decorated living soldier in the known galaxy. He had served in 7 major coalition campaigns across 50 years and had never once been on the losing side of a decisive engagement. He was enormous, even by Kreth standards, tall enough that he moved through the room in a way that shifted its center, scarred in a way that said the injuries had been chosen over surrender, carrying the kind of quiet authority that made other experienced soldiers instinctively straighten when he passed. He had been retired from active command for 6 years and was still the first. Name anyone in any military academy brought up when the word proven came into a conversation. When he entered the reception hall, the room reorganized around him without anyone having to ask. Other veterans followed, Thulian officers moving with their characteristic stillness. Draven commanders acknowledging each other with the precise arm crossings their culture required. Pelari advisors standing in their careful clusters. Each delegation had its own version of the welcome, its own internal language of respect. Then the human delegation arrived. There were 4 of them. General Francis Alcott, retired, who had commanded coalition fleet in the outer campaigns and had a record clean enough to carry real weight. Colonel Derek Shaw, who looked too young for his rank and had a file that explained why his age and his reputation did not match. Communications specialist Paul Greer, quiet and careful and easy to miss if you were not paying attention. And Admiral Owen Vassar, walking at the back of the group with his slight limp and his plain gray uniform and his expression of complete disinterest in being noticed by anyone. Vorn was standing near the central table with a group of Kreth officers. When they humans entered, he glanced at the delegation the way you glance at something peripheral, not rudely, just with the portion of attention that peripheral things deserve. Francis Alcott he noted as someone with rank worth acknowledging. The others he processed and moved past. He turned to the young Kreth aide at his shoulder, the one at the back, gray uniform, the limp attaché. The aide glanced briefly at Vassar. I think so, administrative maybe. He came with the military group. Vorn nodded once and returned to his conversation. It was not contempt, it was simply the conclusion his mind had reached, and he saw no reason to revise it. Lena watched this happen from across the room. She felt Connor go tense beside. Sorry. Don't, she said quietly. I did not say anything. You were about to. He exhaled slowly. He just called a fleet admiral and attaché. He does not know. That is the problem, Connor said. No, Lena said, that is actually the point. Connor did not look like he agreed, but he stayed quiet. On the other side of the hall, Hask Rowe had drawn a natural audience around him. He was not performing for them. It was more that the space near him became engaging the way a fire becomes the natural center of a cold room. He was speaking to a group of younger officers from 3 different species, all of them leaning in slightly, all of them listening with the kind of focus that is given without thinking. Vassar had moved to the far side of the room near one of the observation panels. He stood with a glass of water looking out at the stars entirely alone, not because he had been excluded, though he had been in the casual way that requires no decision and no deliberate choice, simply because the room had looked at him and found nothing worth approaching. He seemed genuinely and completely unbothered by it. There was a moment near the middle of the reception when Vorn crossed toward the refreshment table and did not see Vassar already standing there. He reached past him for a drink without acknowledgement, not rudely, but the way you reach past furniture. Vassar stepped slightly to the side to give him room and said nothing. It was such a small thing, and it said everything. Lena had positioned herself where she could watch without being obvious. She saw Hask grow across the room. Catch that moment, the old general went very still. For just a second, his four eyes tracked from Vorn to Vassar, then he looked away, and whatever had moved across his face passed before anyone could read it clearly. Later, near the end of the reception, Vorn was holding an easy conversation with a group of junior officers. He had been speaking for several minutes about a ground campaign he had led, 14 confirmed engagements across 2 fronts, a number that was genuinely impressive, and that he knew was impressive and was comfortable knowing. 14 ground engagements, he said, setting his drink down for weight. Each one different. You learn things in field command that no simulation gives. You find out what you are made of, and what the soldiers behind you are made of. His audience agreed with the ease of people who had been agreeing all evening. 2 m away, Vassar was refilling his water glass from a table dispenser. He had heard the number, he had heard the tone. He did not turn around. He finished filling the glass, picked it up, and walked quietly back toward the window. His expression had not moved. Lena was watching from across the room, and she felt the familiar weight in her chest, not anger, not sadness, just the particular feeling that came from seeing a large gap between what was visible and what was real. Connor appeared at her shoulder. He did not even turn around. No, she said. Why not? She thought about it carefully. The honest answer was that she had spent years reading about Owen Vassar, not the polished summaries in academy textbooks, but the actual records, the dry, operational reports with their clipped language and their complete absence of drama. Reading those had taught her something. She was still processing. A certain kind of person does not need the room to understand them. They simply continue. The understanding, if it comes, arrives on its own terms, because he already knows what he is. She said he does not need Vorn to confirm it. Connor was quiet after that. Near the window, Vassar stood with his water glass and looked at the stars. Light from the observation panel caught the small pins on his collar, plain and easy to miss if you were not looking for them. His face was still. Outside the glass, the galaxy went on in all its indifferent immensity, and he seemed somehow entirely at home in it. Lena looked at him for a long moment. Tomorrow would come, and then the day after, and eventually the moment would arrive when the room would know what it was standing next to. Until then, the stars were patient, and so was he. Yara Axe did not sleep well that night, and she was not someone who typically had that problem. She had trained herself early in her education to manage her mental state with precision. Thulian cognitive discipline was not mythology, it was a real and practiced skill, and Yara had been one of the better students in her cohort when it came to ordered thinking and controlled rest. She did not lie. Awake because of stress. She did not lie. Awake because of doubt. She lay awake. Now because of a specific and irritating kind of curiosity that she could not resolve without data. She wanted to know what Owen Vassar had actually done. It was a small thing, she told herself, as she sat up in her bunk and pulled the small terminal from the shelf beside her. She was not reconsidering her position from the cultural exchange exercise. She still believed what she had said, that a legend required scale, that endurance alone was not the same as impact. She was simply gathering information. It was what she always did. She entered Owen Vassar's name into the Public Coalition Military Archive. The results were not what she expected. They were not unimpressive. That was not the surprise. The surprise was how thin they were for an officer of his rank, for a man who had apparently accumulated enough service to earn the title of Admiral. The public record was surprisingly spare. A few early campaign citations, each noted in the flat language of standard military reports, 2 commendations from the outer engagement period, a notation of distinguished service attached to an action at something called Yalin Station, described in 4 sentences and then closed, and then a gap of several years with nothing filed, followed by his current posting. That was all. Yara sat with the terminal in her hands. For a moment, she had looked up dozens of veteran records over the course of her training, and she knew what a full file looked like, even a modest one. This was not modest. This was actively lean in a way that felt deliberate, rather than empty, as if large sections of it had been carefully placed somewhere else. She closed the archive and went to the station's common area to think. Lena Cole was already there. This was not particularly unusual. Lena seemed to operate on a sleep schedule that did not match the rest of the human cadets, and Yara had passed her in the common area before at odd hours. She was sitting at one of the far tables with a cup of something warm and a closed data pad in front of her, looking at nothing in particular. Yara sat across from her without asking. Lena looked up but did not seem surprised. I looked up Vassar, Yara said. Lena said nothing. His public record is almost empty. I know. For a man of his rank, that is unusual. Yes, Lena said, it is. Yara set her hands flat on the table. I am not asking for a debate. I am asking you directly whether there is more to that record than the open archive shows, because what I found does not account for the way you and the other humans in this station look at him. Lena was quiet for a moment, then she picked up her data pad and turned it on. She navigated through several layers of clearance protocols, the kind that required biometric confirmation and a personal access code, until she reached a directory that Yara's clearance level did not include. She turned the pad to face the Thulian. I can show you parts of it, she said. Not all of it, but enough. Yara leaned forward. The first entry Lena opened was from 28 years ago. Vassar had been a young sergeant at the time, assigned to a coalition relay station on a moon called Callus IV. The station had been strategically important. It handled communication, routing for a wide sector of the outer front. An opposing force had moved to take it. According to the report, the defending force numbered 12 humans. The attacking force numbered Approximately 400 enemy combatants with armored support. The relay station held for 9 days. Yara read the report twice. The language was clinical. It described resource consumption, defensive positions taken, tactical decisions made with available material. It noted that the human unit had reinforced 3 separate points using structural components of the station itself. It noted that they had rotated sleep and shift so that at least 8 of the 12 were awake and active at all times. It noted that on the 7th day, the force had conducted a deliberate forward push that disrupted the enemy's resupply line and bought 2 additional days of position. At the end of 9 days, coalition relief forces arrived to find the station intact and 11 of the 12 defenders alive. Vassar's name appeared twice in the report, once as the unit's ranking non-commissioned officer, once in a line that read plainly and without elaboration, Sergeant Vassar's tactical decisions on days 3 and 7 are assessed as the primary factors in the unit's ability to hold position. Yara said nothing. She reached out and touched the screen to scroll to the next entry. The second record was from the Marines. Deep engagement, a name Yara recognized from coalition history as a minor action. In the outer campaigns, minor meaning it had never been flagged as significant. In the standard histories, the record Lena had opened told a different version. A human platoon operating without air support and with limited communications had identified and disrupted an enemy naval coordination center using no specialist equipment, no satellite guidance, no electronic suppression capability, no armored vehicles. They had used terrain mapping, a detailed understanding of the enemy's movement patterns developed over 2 weeks of close observation, and a diagram drawn by hand on a piece of flat material from a field ration container. The operation had prevented 3 coordinated strikes on coalition resupply lines. According to the assessment at the end of the document, those strikes, had they succeeded, would have significantly extended the outer campaign and increased projected casualties by tens of thousands across all coalition species. The platoon was never publicly cited. The operation remained classified. Yara looked up at Lena. Why was this never released? Lena pulled the pad back and closed the second file. The assessors flagged it for reclassification and sealed it. The official reasoning was operational security. They did not want the methods understood by opposing parties. She paused, but there was a second reason noted in the internal record. Some members of the assessment panel felt that if the full picture of what the human units had been doing became widely known, it would shift the way other species perceived humanity in a way that might create instability. Things would change too fast. Yara stared at her. They concealed it because they thought it would frighten people. They concealed it, Lena said carefully, because they thought the galaxy was not ready for it yet. There is a difference, though I understand why it might not feel like one. Yara was quiet for a long moment. Outside the common area's single small window, the stars held their positions. You said there was a third entry, Yara said finally. Lena hesitated. Then she opened the last file. Yalin Station. The 4-sentence public entry became, in the classified version, 11 dense pages of operational detail. Vassar had been a colonel. The station had been evacuating civilian personnel from a contested sector, a section of the access corridor between the civilian deck and the docking ports had been hit, and the manual release mechanism had failed. Someone had to stay and hold the door open manually, physically, using body weight and a piece of structural piping, while the engineering team worked to restore power to the docking bay. It had taken 40 minutes, 3,114. Civilians had reached the ships. Vassar had been the one at the door. Alone 40 minutes, the report noted that his left knee had been damaged early in the hold and that he had continued. Regardless, the injury never fully healed. He still walked with a limp. Yara read the last page slowly, then she sat back in her chair. The common area was silent around them. Why does he not speak about any of this, she asked. Lena thought for a moment before answering, I think because it never occurred to him that he should have to. She said. Yara looked down at her hands on the table. After a long time, she said quietly, I could not sleep tonight. I know, Lena said, some things work on you that way. The war strategy seminar was held in the Academy's main lecture hall, a tiered space designed to seat 60, currently holding 43 cadets, 9 visiting senior officers and 1 retired admiral who had taken a seat near the back and brought his own cup of water. Director Pellin opened the session by naming the topic as the Battle of Drevens Pass, which he described as the most instructive example of catastrophic Allied failure in modern coalition history. Every serious military student knew the name. Drevens Pass had been, 30 years ago, the closest the Galactic Coalition had ever come to total collapse in the field. A well-positioned enemy force, the Veil Dominion at the peak of their expansion, had met the Allied fleet and ground forces at a choke point system and broken them so completely that the coalition retreat had been recorded as one of the most disorganized withdrawals in recorded interstellar military history. It was taught not as a study of defeat, but as a study of how defeat compounds when decision-making falls apart under pressure. Hask Rose sat in the front row. He had been invited specifically for this session, and the director had made his participation welcome. The old general gave his analysis first. It was by any measure excellent. He spoke for 20 minutes, breaking down the coalition's positioning errors at each stage of the engagement, identifying the communication failures that had prevented an effective response to the Veil flanking maneuver, placing the exact decision points where a different choice would have changed the outcome. He spoke without notes, without apparent effort, with the total authority of someone who had studied this battle for decades and had also been alive at the time it occurred. The room was absorbed completely. Then a junior Kreth cadet in the 4th row, a young officer named Taver, who had the habit of asking questions designed to show how sharp he was rather than because he genuinely needed the answer, raised his hand and turned not to Haskell Rowe but to the back of the room. Admiral, he said, looking directly at Vassar, I understand human forces were present at Drevens Pass. Given what we know about the engagement and its outcome, I'm curious what role your people played in the coalition's difficulties there. The phrasing was careful enough to avoid being openly disrespectful. It was not careful enough to avoid being what it was. Several cadets smiled. Vorn, seated near the front, did not smile, but he did not object to the question either. Vassar set his water cup down on the narrow armrest beside his seat. In the front row Haskell Rowe went completely still. It was not the stillness of discomfort, it was the stillness of a soldier who has just heard something and decided to pay very close attention. Vassar said, "I was at Drevon's Pass." The room was quiet. He said it simply, with no particular weight, the way you confirm a fact that has already been established and requires no decoration. "I was a lieutenant at the time," he continued. "I was commanding a small ground unit on the left flank. I can tell you what happened from that position if it is useful to the discussion." Director Pellin nodded once. "Please." Vassar did not stand. He spoke from his seat in the back row, which meant that everyone had to turn slightly to face him. Somehow this arrangement suited exactly the way he spoke, unhurried, direct, completely without performance. He described the first day of the engagement. The coalition had held their positions until the Vale flanking maneuver struck the Allied left, at which point the command structure began to come apart in real time. Units across the left flank started pulling back, not because they were ordered to. In many cases, the order simply never arrived, but because the instinct in a collapsing position is to move towards safety. That instinct is not wrong. Under most conditions, it is correct. "The left flank broke," he said. "I will not soften that. It broke." No one in the room moved. My unit had not received the retreat order. Our communication equipment had been damaged in the first Vale strike. We did not know the left flank was collapsing around us. We knew the enemy was pressing hard, and we knew the position we were holding was important, and we had not been told to leave it. He paused, so we stayed. He described the next 72 hours with the same precise, clinical language as the records Lena had shown Yara 3 nights before, the moment they understood the full scale of what had happened around them. The enemy numbers pressing from 3 directions, the assessment of what was available, not much but something. The decision made without ceremony to stop moving backward. We did not have a defensive plan drawn up, he said. We built one using whatever the terrain and the wreckage gave us. We slept in 90-minute rotation, so that the unit was never more than a quarter down at any one time. When the enemy surged hard on the second day, we did not fall back. We moved forward into the surge because the calculation said that moving forward was less costly than giving ground. We took a position we had not expected to hold, which disrupted their timing and left us better placed than when we had started. He said this the way someone describes a practical decision about how to organize supplies, not modestly. Modesty would have suggested the achievement required downplaying. Just plainly. On the third day, the coalition forces that had retreated had reorganized enough to begin looking at recovery options. When they identified that the human unit on the left flank had not only held but advanced, the shape of the situation changed. The left flank was not gone. There was still a position. There was still a gap in the Vale line that the coalition could move back through. He picked up his water cup. The battle is taught as a catastrophic loss. In terms of the first 48 hours, that assessment is accurate. In terms of the final outcome, which was a contested withdrawal rather than a complete rout The human units on the left flank were a significant contributing factor, that is. Not in the public record, I am telling you, because the question was asked. He drank from the cup. The room was so quiet that the small sound of him setting it back on the armrest was audible to the front row. Hasbro stood. He rose from his seat slowly to his full height, which was considerable. He turned to face the back of the room. Then he placed his lower right fist against the center of his chest and held it there. The Kreth salute reserved in their culture for those they considered equals, not subordinates, not commanders, but equals in the deepest sense of the word, soldiers who had proven something that could not be argued with. Hasbro had given that salute perhaps a dozen times in his career. Several cadets near him looked at each other with expressions that said they were recalibrating something quickly and were not entirely sure how far the revision went. Vassar acknowledged the salute with a single small nod. Then he picked up his data pad and looked at it as if the seminar had returned to its normal course. In the fourth row, Taver was staring at his desk. Vorn was staring at the back of Hasbro's head, watching the old general return slowly to his seat. Something moved across Vorn's face, not a simple thing, not something that could be captured in one word. It was the expression of a man who has been certain of his understanding for a long time and has just been shown quietly and without drama that the map he had been using was wrong. He did not look at Vassar. He looked at his own hands on the table in front of him, and for the first time in the entire week, he had nothing to say. Vorn found Vassar on the observation deck 3 hours after the seminar ended. He had not planned to go looking for him. He spent those 3 hours in 2 different places, first in the training room, running drills past the point when they were useful, which he sometimes did when something was sitting in him that needed somewhere to go, and then in the corridor outside his quarters, standing still and being honest with himself about what was happening in his thinking. What was happening was that he was wrong, and he knew it, and the knowing was not comfortable. Vassar was standing at the far end of the observation deck, at the long curved window that looked out into open space. He was alone. He held nothing, no cup, no data pad. He was simply standing and watching the stars in that particular way Vorn had noticed him doing all week. Not as if he were thinking through something, but as if he were remembering it. Vorn crossed the deck. His footsteps were loud in the empty space. Vassar did not turn, but he acknowledged the approach by shifting his weight slightly, which Vorn understood as permission to stand beside him. He stopped at the window and looked at the same view. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. "I was wrong about you," Vorn said. "You did not know," Vassar said. "I made assumptions I should not have made." Vassar looked at him briefly from the side. "Assumptions are efficient," he said. "Most of the time they serve you well. You happen to encounter a case where they did not." This was not the response Vorn had prepared for. He had expected some form of correction, or at the very least an acknowledgement of the weight of what had been said and done. What he received instead was a man who had clearly already moved past the part that was sitting heavily on Vorn and was simply standing at a window. "Why did you say nothing?" Vorn asked. "At the cultural exchange exercise when the room laughed, you were there. You heard everything. Vassar looked back at the stars because it was not time yet. Time for what? For any of it to carry meaning for you. He said it without edge, without bitterness. If I had stood up in that room and said something, what would you have done? You would have listened and categorized it as an old soldier defending his people's reputation. You would not have believed it at the level that actually changes anything because you had no frame for it. People do not truly learn from information alone. They learn from information that arrives at the right moment when they are ready to receive it. Vorn was quiet for a while. Hask drove. Knew, he said, he knew who you were. Before the seminar. He knew before this week, Vassar said. He said nothing either. No. Why not? Vassar thought for a moment before answering, because Hask drove. Understands that people have to arrive at things themselves. A conclusion handed to you does not carry the same weight as when you reach on your own. He let you see it when you are ready to see it. That is a form of respect. Vorn turned this over carefully. He thought about the reception, about reaching past the admiral for a drink. Without acknowledging him, he thought about calling him an ass. He thought about Tavr's question in the seminar, a question Vorn had not stopped, and now wished he had. At Drevon's Pass, he said, how many humans were on the left flank? 31, Vassar said. And you held for 3 days. We held for 3 days. Vorn looked at him. Against how many? Vassar was quiet for a moment. The final count when the relief force went in and assessed was 419 combatants with armored support. Vaughn absorbed this. He had been in 14 ground campaigns. He knew what numbers meant. He knew what 419 with armored support looked like against 31 with no outside communication and no resupply. Your people do not build monuments to this, he said. It was not quite a question. No. Why not? Because the people who do these things are not doing them for monuments. Vassar said, they are doing them because the situation requires it and they happen to be the ones present. Monuments are for later, for other people, for those who need the record to be visible. The soldiers doing the work are generally occupied with the work. Vaughn looked back at the stars. He thought about Sareth, the warlord whose name he had grown up knowing before he could hold a training weapon. He thought about the way he had told that story in the training hall, the pride in it, the easy ownership. He thought about Lena Cole walking quietly back to her seat and sitting down and saying nothing, and what she had known in that moment that he had not. Are all human soldiers like this? He asked. Vassar looked at him for a moment. The question seemed to interest him slightly, more than the previous ones, which he had answered with the ease of questions he had been asked before. He considered this one longer. Not all of us, he said. We are not a species without fear or failure. We have both in full measure, but there is something in humans that becomes more determined as the situation becomes worse. For most species, increasing difficulty produces a proportional increase in the instinct to stop. For humans, at a certain threshold, the difficulty itself becomes the reason to continue. We do not fully understand it ourselves. It is not something that can be trained into a person. It was already there. He paused. You fight to win. That is a complete motivation and an effective one. We fight because something in us refuses to accept the only other option. That is a different kind of motivation. It does not run out the same way. Vorn stood with this for a long time. You were treated badly in the station. He said finally, by me and by others. I want you to know that I understand what that means now, and I am sorry for the part I played in it. Vassar looked at him. It was a direct and level look without performance. Accepted, he said simply, not magnanimously, not with the weight of forgiveness being extended, just accepted, finished, move forward. Vorn nodded once. They stood in silence for a while. Longer, both looking out at the stars. Two soldiers from different ends of the galaxy in a room that asked nothing of either of them in the particular stillness that exists between people who have arrived by different paths at the same place. The graduation ceremony was held in the main assembly hall the following morning. The cadets stood in their rows in the formal dress of their species. Director Pellin stood at the front and read the names in standard order. When he reached the human cadets, he read Connor Webb's name first. Both humans in the hall stood. That had always been the human tradition at this academy. When one of yours is named, you rise. Then he read Lena Cole's name. Lena stepped forward from her row. Behind her, Connor was already on his feet. The second human cadet who had come up through the program stood too, on the far side of the hall. Then Hask Rose stood. He rose from his seat in the visiting dignitary section without ceremony and without any signal to those around him. He simply rose slowly and fully to his considerable height. His Kreth delegation followed without hesitation. Then Vaughn stood from the senior cadet section. He stood without looking around to see if others were following. He had decided, and he stood. Then others, one by one, and then in groups, Thulian officers who had spent the last few nights with information. They could not stop turning over. Draven cadets who had watched Hask Rose salute in the seminar and understood what it meant from someone they had admired their entire careers. Pellery advisors who had been quiet and watchful all week and had drawn their own conclusions. Junior officers from 4 different species who had come into this station, certain of a great many things, and were leaving with a considerably more complicated map. The room came to its feet, not because of protocol required it, not because a senior officer had called for it, but because something had shifted, quietly and without announcement, over the course of an ordinary week in an ordinary station, and the people in that room had felt it shift and were now standing at the place it had brought them to. Lena Cole stood at the front of the hall and looked at all of them. She did not look surprised. She looked the way a person looks when something they have believed for a very long time, quietly and without needing it confirmed, is finally seen by the room around them. Not relief, not triumph, something gentler and more durable than either of those things. In the back row, Owen Vassar was already standing. He had stood when the first human name was called, because that was always the reason. He watched the room rise around Lena, and his expression was the same calm, open expression it always was. But for just a moment, something behind his eyes moved, not pride, not the satisfaction of being proven right. Something older and deeper and quieter than both of those things. The kind of feeling that belongs to a person who has spent a long time trusting that the truth does not require an announcement. that it simply holds its position and waits